The palace has always thrived on mystery. Its walls are high not just to keep people out, but to contain secrets that, if unleashed, could shatter the carefully crafted image of the monarchy. For generations, the British royal family has been wrapped in an aura of dignity, legacy, and unbroken bloodlines. But what happens when the one thing that anchors royalty, the very question of who belongs and who does not, is thrown into doubt? What happens when the truth is no longer speculation, no longer tabloid gossip, but scientific fact that cannot be undone? That is the storm that Prince Harry found himself in when a DNA test unearthed what many whispered in hushed tones for decades. King Charles is not his father. To understand the weight of this revelation, you must step into the shoes of Harry himself. Imagine growing up knowing the world is constantly comparing you to your older brother. William was the golden child, the heir, the one destiny smiled upon. Harry was the spare, a phrase that followed him into adulthood like a shadow. And even though he bore the title of prince, there was always a gnawing undertone in conversations, an echo in the press, and a mocking sneer in tabloid covers that suggested something more sinister, that perhaps he was never meant to be royal at all. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the earliest days, speculation about Harry's paternity simmered beneath the surface of royal gossip. His fiery red hair, so unlike Charles's, seemed to bear an uncanny resemblance to another man, James Hewitt, the cavalry officer with whom Diana had a well-documented affair. While the official story insisted that Diana's relationship with Hewitt began after Harry's birth, doubt lingered. The public never stopped asking. And while the palace brushed these claims aside, the whispers only grew stronger, embedding themselves into the public consciousness until they became part of the narrative of Harry's life. But let us pause for a moment and consider this. What is it like to live your entire life under a microscope, where strangers question the very blood that runs in your veins? What is it like to see newspaper headlines debating your parentage when you are still a child, trying to make sense of your mother's love, your father's approval, and your place in a family that seems more institution than home? For Harry, this was no theoretical torment. This was the reality of growing up royal, of being constantly defined not by who he was, but by who others thought he might not be. It is within this backdrop of tension, suspicion, and silence that the truth finally arrived. A DNA test, something cold, clinical, and irrefutable, was the catalyst that transformed whispers into undeniable fact. For years, Harry had battled with identity. He had broken from the royal family, sought solace in America, tried to carve out a life separate from the shadows of Buckingham Palace. But even oceans and new beginnings could not drown out the one question that had haunted him since boyhood. Was Charles truly his father? And when the answer finally came, it shattered him. This revelation was not just about biology. It was about betrayal, secrecy, and the weight of a legacy built on half-truths. Harry's tears, as reported, were not simply about losing a father, because Charles, whether by blood or not, had raised him. His tears were about the collapse of identity. If you strip away the monarchy, the titles, the wealth, what remains? Family. And when even that foundation proves to be built on lies, where does one stand? The story of Harry's DNA test is not only his personal tragedy, it is the continuation of Diana's unending shadow. Princess Diana, the woman the world adored, carried her own secrets. Her loneliness within the palace walls drove her into the arms of men who offered the affection she was denied. James Hewitt was one of those men. And now, decades later, the consequences of her choices echo through her son's life, long after her death. One cannot help but wonder, did Diana know that Harry was not Charles's son? Did she try to shield him from the truth? Did she plan to one day reveal it, only for fate to silence her before she could? The monarchy is built on lineage, on the continuity of blood. It is the reason the institution exists. The crown passes from one generation to the next, unquestioned, because its legitimacy rests on birthright. But what happens when a prince's birthright is suddenly thrown into doubt? What happens when the very bloodline that sustains the monarchy is revealed to be fractured? This is not just Harry's personal crisis. It is a constitutional earthquake. If Harry is not Charles's biological son, Then his place in the line of succession, his titles, his very identity as a Windsor, all stand on shaky ground. And yet, beyond the legal implications lies the deeper, more devastating emotional reality. Harry's world has been turned upside down. The introduction to this story cannot gloss over the human element, because that is where its power lies. We can dissect the scandal, analyze its impact on the monarchy, and speculate about public reaction. But at its core, this is the story of a man confronting the truth about who he is. Imagine the moment Harry first saw the results. A sheet of paper, a cold report from a laboratory, spelling out in numbers and percentages what decades of whispers had suggested. In that moment, all the doubts he had carried crystallized into a truth that could never be undone. His tears were not weakness. They were the collapse of a lifetime of questions suddenly answered, of a childhood lived under false assurances, of a man realizing that the mother he loved so deeply had taken a truth to the grave that could only be resurrected by science. This is not a tabloid scandal. This is not gossip. This is an unraveling of identity, a stripping away of everything Harry thought he knew about himself. And for the royal family, the fallout is catastrophic. A monarchy that relies on myth cannot withstand the intrusion of science. The public may forgive scandal, infidelity, even political missteps. But what happens when the public realizes that the bloodline itself is compromised? For centuries, kings and queens justified their power by the divine right of blood. Now, one of the most beloved royals, Diana's youngest son, stands as living proof that even the bloodline of Windsor is not immune to fracture. The beginning of this story shocks us with its intimacy, its humanity, its pain. The middle draws us deeper into Diana's shadow, into the decisions and relationships that led to this truth. And the end forces us to confront the consequences. What this means for Harry, for William, for Charles, and for the monarchy itself. But one thing is clear from the very start. The truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced. Harry's tears mark not just his own devastation, but the beginning of a reckoning for the House of Windsor. This is where we begin, on the edge of revelation, standing with Harry as the truth crashes down around him. A son stripped of certainty, a mother's secret finally exposed, and a monarchy forced to face what it has long denied. The story ahead is not just about DNA. It is about identity, loyalty, betrayal, and the unrelenting power of truth. Every great house, every family bound by duty and legacy, carries with it rumors that refuse to die. For the House of Windsor, one of the most enduring whispers has always been about Prince Harry's paternity. Long before DNA tests could prove or disprove it, long before Harry himself confronted the reality, palace corridors were alive with hushed voices and knowing looks. Staff who served Diana and Charles during the 1980s and 1990s often recalled tension, cold exchanges, and secrets that clung to the air like perfume after a royal banquet. Those whispers would slowly escape beyond the palace gates, feeding the tabloids and fueling speculation in a way that no press officer, however skilled, could contain. The first seeds of doubt were planted not in scandal sheets, but in the contrasts between the two brothers. William, born in 1982, bore the features the monarchy found comforting. He resembled Charles enough to quiet any doubt, his appearance aligning with the Windsor line. Harry, born in 1984, was different. His striking red hair and mischievous grin reminded many not of Charles, but of someone else entirely. The British press, relentless in its hunger for royal intrigue, seized on this difference. Photos of Harry were routinely placed beside images of James Hewitt, the dashing cavalry officer whose affair with Diana would later be revealed. The resemblance, though unfair to the young boy at the time, became a drumbeat too loud to ignore. Within palace walls, staffers claimed to hear jokes made in cruel jest, whispers traded in corridors, suggesting Charles himself was not blind to the speculation. Reports have since circulated that Charles, in moments of bitterness during his troubled marriage with Diana, would dismiss Harry with words that hinted at doubt rather than pride. The very idea that the heir to the throne might question the legitimacy of his own son is enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone who understands the monarchy's obsession with bloodline. Yet it was precisely this coldness that fueled public suspicion. The media, emboldened during the late 1980s and early 1990s, found the story irresistible. Headlines blared questions about Harry's paternity, often veiled in innuendo but unmistakable in their implication. For Diana, who was already struggling under the weight of an unhappy marriage and an unyielding institution, these rumors cut deep. She loved her son fiercely, and to see the world question him in such a cruel, personal way only reinforced her sense of isolation within the royal family. The whispers inside the palace had become shouts outside its gates, and no amount of press management could bury them. What few knew at the time was that Diana herself did little to silence the storm. In her candid conversations with trusted friends, she hinted at truths that left even her closest confidants uncertain. Her bond with James Hewitt was not a matter of passing flirtation, but of years. Their relationship, though complicated, had an intimacy that made speculation about Harry's paternity plausible. Diana admitted to her need for affection, something Charles had long withheld. The public, upon learning of her unhappiness, connected the dots in ways that left Harry vulnerable to ridicule and suspicion. Imagine being Harry in those early years, old enough to read headlines yet too young to defend yourself. Classmates, emboldened by cruel gossip, whispered about his mother's alleged affair. The weight of being royal is already heavy for a child, but for Harry, there was an added cruelty, a question about whether he belonged in the very family that defined his life. The whispers in the palace had escaped into playgrounds, schools, and tabloids, ensuring that Harry grew up in the shadow of doubt he did not ask for. The whispers also revealed the hypocrisy of royal image-making. For decades, the monarchy cultivated an aura of perfection, shielding its flaws behind velvet curtains and golden crowns. Yet here was a rumor so raw, so personal, that even the royal machinery could not silence it. The palace tried issuing denials. Spokespersons stressed that Diana's relationship with Hewitt began after Harry's birth. They insisted there was no possibility of him being Harry's father. But denial often feeds suspicion, and in this case, it only seemed to fan the flames. Behind closed doors, courtiers scrambled. The monarchy thrives on continuity. For centuries, kings and queens have justified their reign by tracing unbroken lines of blood. The idea that one of Diana's children might not be of Windsor blood was not just a personal scandal. It was an institutional threat. If proven, it would undermine the very legitimacy of Harry's titles, his place in the line of succession, and the stability of the crown itself. Such stakes ensured that whispers were never just idle gossip. They were daggers pointed at the heart of monarchy itself. One must also consider the role of timing. The 1990s were a turbulent period for the royal family. Diana's tell-all interviews, particularly her groundbreaking panorama conversation in 1995, revealed a deeply unhappy marriage and exposed Charles's infidelity with Camilla Parker Bowles. In that environment, whispers about Harry gained new strength. If Charles could betray Diana, could Diana not have sought comfort elsewhere? And if she did, could Harry be the result? The public connected these dots eagerly, often cruelly, with little concern for the boy caught in the middle. Even more damning were the comments Diana allegedly made in private. Several of her friends later recalled her confessions of love for Hewitt, as well as the emotional bond they shared. Though Diana never publicly confirmed that Harry was Hewitt's son, her openness about her unhappiness in marriage left room for speculation. Was she shielding Harry from a truth he was not ready to face? Or was the resemblance merely coincidence, magnified by a world desperate for scandal? The whispers never faded, and in fact, they grew louder as Harry became a young man. His resemblance to Hewitt was brought up repeatedly by tabloids, often with side-by-side photographs that made the comparison unavoidable. It wasn't just hair color. It was the shape of the face, the mischievous smile, the expressions caught in candid moments. For the public, it became a cruel parlor game. For Harry, it was a lifelong wound. Yet despite the rumors, there were defenders. Close friends of Diana insisted that Harry was already a toddler when she met Hewitt, making it biologically impossible for him to be Hewitt's son. Even Hewitt himself, in moments of candor, denied paternity. And yet, those denials never carried as much weight as the whispers themselves. For a public fascinated by royal scandal, the idea that Harry might not be Charles's son was simply too explosive to let go of. The palace walls, which were meant to protect, had instead become amplifiers. The whispers that began as quiet speculation in drawing rooms and staff quarters had grown into a chorus that followed Harry wherever he went. By the time he entered adulthood, the whispers had taken on a life of their own, cementing themselves in the public imagination as one of the great unresolved mysteries of the royal family. And so the stage was set. A boy born into a family obsessed with image and bloodline, growing into a man constantly haunted by doubts about both. The whispers of the palace had laid the foundation for what would later become undeniable truth. A truth that no denial, no carefully worded statement, and no royal silence could erase. The story of Harry's DNA was not born in a laboratory. It was born in these whispers, in the uneasy corridors of palaces, in the unspoken doubts of those closest to him. And once whispers like these take root, they rarely die. They grow, they linger, and eventually, they demand to be heard. This was only the beginning. The whispers that once echoed softly through palace walls would soon grow into revelations that could shake the monarchy itself. The whispers about Harry's paternity might have remained mere speculation, dismissed as cruel tabloid gossip, had it not been for Diana herself. The late Princess of Wales was a woman caught between two worlds, the rigid, suffocating structure of the monarchy and the vulnerable, open heart of a woman desperate for love and truth. She was adored by the public, yet crushed by the institution. And in her loneliness, she made confessions, sometimes spoken, sometimes written, that would later take on a haunting significance. These confessions, preserved in the memories of her closest friends and in letters that have resurfaced, painted a picture of a woman torn apart by betrayal and longing. They also offered glimpses into secrets she carried, secrets that may have included the truth about Harry's father. Diana's story is inseparable from pain. From the moment she entered the royal family, she was thrust into a role that offered her no roadmap. Married at 19 to a man more than a decade her senior, she quickly realized that her marriage to Prince Charles was not built on the kind of love she had dreamed of as a young girl. Charles's enduring affection for Camilla Parker Bowles was no secret to Diana, and it haunted her from the start. She once described her wedding day as the worst day of my life, because she already knew Charles's heart belonged to another. In such a cold marriage, Diana sought warmth elsewhere, and it was in that quest for affection that she met James Hewitt. Hewitt was not the first man Diana leaned on for comfort, but he was perhaps the one with whom she formed the deepest bond outside her marriage. A cavalry officer, he embodied charm and gallantry, qualities Diana had longed for. Their affair, by all accounts, lasted several years. He offered her companionship, laughter, and an escape from the suffocating pressures of palace life. In her private conversations with trusted confidants, Diana did not shy away from acknowledging her affection for him. She called him kind, supportive, and attentive in ways Charles never was. Her words, later revealed in interviews and letters, suggested not only emotional intimacy, but physical closeness that made speculation about Harry's paternity plausible. One of the most striking confessions Diana made came during her conversations with Andrew Morton, whose 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, stunned the world. In the secretly recorded tapes she provided, Diana described her feelings of abandonment by Charles and her deep depression. While Morton's book did not explicitly confirm Harry's paternity rumors, it offered enough glimpses into Diana's unhappiness and her search for love to keep the speculation alive. She revealed how she craved affection and how her relationships outside the marriage filled a void that Charles refused to acknowledge. Friends who knew Diana closely often described her as both candid and careful. With some, she spoke freely of her love for Hewitt. She admitted that she trusted him, confided in him, and shared parts of herself she could never reveal to the world. With others, she chose silence, perhaps fearful of how far the truth could spread. Among the letters and notes Diana wrote during those turbulent years, a recurring theme emerges: her desperate need for honesty and her struggle with the suffocating secrets imposed upon her by royal life. One particular set of letters, now infamous, was sent by Diana to her friends and butlers, expressing her despair over the state of her marriage. She wrote of betrayal, of feeling like a pawn in a larger royal game, and of her longing to break free. In some of these writings, she hinted at carrying truths that she dared not speak aloud. Some historians and commentators have speculated that these truths may have included doubts about Harry's paternity. While Diana never confirmed this in writing, the ambiguity of her words left the door open for interpretation. The Panorama interview of 1995 marked another critical moment in Diana's confessional journey. In the now iconic broadcast with journalist Martin Bashir, Diana famously said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," referring to Camilla. But beyond that headline-grabbing line, Diana also spoke candidly about her struggles, her search for love, and her need to be heard. She admitted openly to affairs, describing them not as reckless choices, but as desperate attempts to cope with her emotional neglect. Her frankness shocked the monarchy and endeared her even more to the public, who saw her not as a cold figurehead, but as a flesh-and-blood woman vulnerable to the same heartbreak as anyone else. It was in these candid moments that Diana revealed not only her heart, but also her defiance. She broke the golden rule of the monarchy: never complain, never explain, by baring her soul to the world. Yet what she did not reveal in that interview may be just as important as what she did. While she admitted to affairs and acknowledged her love for Hewitt, she stopped short of addressing the whispers about Harry directly. That silence spoke volumes. Was she protecting Harry from a truth too devastating for him to carry? Was she shielding the monarchy from a scandal too large to contain? Or did she, in fact, believe that Harry was Charles's son despite the public's obsession with proving otherwise? Even after her death, Diana's confessions continued to surface in fragments. Letters found, recordings replayed, interviews re-examined. Each piece of her private thoughts added another layer to the story, fueling the speculation that she had left behind a truth too explosive to share while alive. Her letters often conveyed an awareness of danger, a sense that forces within the monarchy wanted her silenced. She once wrote of her fear that she might not survive the intrigues of palace politics, a chilling prediction given the circumstances of her death in Paris in 1997. For Harry, these confessions and letters were not abstract history. They were his inheritance. Long before he sought a DNA test, he had to live with the reality of his mother's vulnerability and her secrets. He read her words, saw her tears, and carried the burden of her pain. Imagine being the son of Diana, loved by millions, yet tormented by rumors that cut to the heart of who you are. Imagine finding letters in which your mother admitted her unhappiness, her longing, her need for love outside her marriage, and then wondering, what did that mean for me? Was she writing about my father? Was she hiding something about my very existence? The confessions and hidden letters of Diana set the stage for Harry's journey toward truth. They were breadcrumbs left by a woman who had been both silenced and outspoken, who lived a life of contradictions. They hinted at secrets too large for the monarchy to contain and too personal for Harry to ignore. In them lay the haunting possibility that the question of Harry's paternity was not just tabloid gossip, but a shadow that Diana herself carried, one she may have chosen never to illuminate fully. And so, the whispers of the palace found echoes in the confessions of the princess. Together, they created a narrative too powerful to ignore. For Harry, every word his mother spoke, every letter she wrote, was a puzzle piece in the story of his identity. And as he grew older, those pieces demanded to be assembled, no matter how painful the picture might turn out to be. What Diana left behind was more than a legacy of compassion and defiance. She left behind questions that would one day drive her youngest son to seek the truth in a way she never could. Her confessions and letters, once dismissed as the emotional outpourings of a lonely princess, would later serve as the foundation for the revelation that would shatter Harry's world. To understand the storm that engulfed Prince Harry's life, one cannot avoid the figure at the center of the controversy, James Hewitt. His name has long been tied to Diana's story, whispered in tabloids, spoken of in interviews, and invoked whenever speculation about Harry's true paternity resurfaced. Hewitt was not just another passing presence in Diana's life. He was a man with whom she shared years of companionship, intimacy, and trust. To the public, he became the symbol of suspicion, the man whose red hair and features seemed to mirror those of a young Harry more closely than those of King Charles. The Hewitt connection was more than rumor. It was the thread that tied together the whispers, the letters, and the confessions into something that demanded attention. James Hewitt was a cavalry officer, polished, charming, and gallant in the way young Diana longed for. Their paths crossed in the mid-1980s when Diana, already trapped in an unhappy marriage, was searching for solace beyond the rigid coldness of Charles. By this time, the cracks in the Wales marriage were obvious. Charles's affection for Camilla Parker Bowles was a poorly kept secret, and Diana, still in her 20s, found herself alone in palaces filled with courtiers but void of warmth. Into this emptiness stepped Hewitt. Accounts from those close to Diana describe their relationship as more than a fling. It was, in many ways, the love story she had been denied within her marriage. Hewitt offered what Charles withheld: attention, laughter, validation, and tenderness. Their relationship lasted nearly 5 years, stretching from 1986 into the early 1990s, and it became a constant in Diana's life during some of her darkest days. For a woman who once said she felt like a lamb to the slaughter when she married into the royal family, Hewitt was a reprieve from the loneliness. As the affair unfolded, secrecy was paramount. Diana was not blind to the dangers of exposure. For a senior royal, to be caught in a long-term relationship outside of marriage would invite scandal of unthinkable proportions. Yet despite the risks, she continued to see Hewitt, even arranging for him to stay at Highgrove when Charles was away. Trusted friends and staff, sworn to discretion, became silent witnesses to their meetings. These hidden visits later became the fodder for books, interviews, and eventually, the media circus that connected Hewitt's name forever to Harry. Why did the connection between Hewitt and Harry become so potent? The answer lies in appearances. Harry's red hair, a hallmark of Hewitt's own appearance, became the most striking point of comparison. The public was eager to latch onto physical similarities as proof of what they already wanted to believe. Tabloid covers juxtaposed photos of Harry and Hewitt, framing the resemblance in ways that seemed undeniable to casual observers. Harry's mischievous grin, his mannerisms, even the shape of his face were scrutinized under the cruel lens of speculation. To a public trained to doubt the official narrative, the visual evidence was enough to plant seeds of certainty. Hewitt himself did not escape the storm. Over the years, he gave interviews that alternated between denial and implication. On several occasions, he insisted that his relationship with Diana began after Harry's birth in 1984, making it impossible for him to be the boy's father. He said Diana met him in 1986, a timeline supported by many accounts. But despite these repeated denials, the resemblance between Harry and Hewitt was too tempting for the public and media to ignore. Every time Hewitt appeared in the press, the paternity question reemerged, as though the truth was hiding in plain sight. Critics often accused Hewitt of exploiting the connection. He appeared in media interviews, collaborated on books, and, at times, seemed to capitalize on the notoriety the affair brought him. This fed public perception that he was more interested in fame than protecting Diana's legacy. For Harry, still young when Hewitt's interviews made headlines, the effect was devastating. Imagine being a child, seeing your mother's lover on television, denying but simultaneously feeding speculation that he could be your father. Imagine the humiliation of schoolyard taunts that echoed the cruel headlines of adults who should have known better. But beyond the media frenzy, there was a deeper truth. Diana truly cared for Hewitt. Friends close to her have confirmed that she loved him, that she trusted him in ways she could not trust Charles or the institution surrounding her. In many ways, Hewitt represented what Diana yearned for: normalcy, affection, and the freedom to be herself. It is easy to forget that beneath the glamour, Diana was still a woman, deeply vulnerable, who wanted to be loved for who she was, not for what she represented. In that sense, Hewitt filled a void that Charles never could. The Hewitt connection also speaks volumes about the monarchy's fragility. Here was a centuries-old institution, rooted in lineage and continuity, shaken not by war or politics, but by a love affair. The monarchy is built on appearances, on the perception of perfection. But Diana's affair with Hewitt exposed the cracks. It reminded the world that behind the crowns and carriages were human beings, with flaws, needs, and secrets. And when those secrets spilled into the public, the result was not just scandal, but the erosion of trust in the royal image. For Harry, the Hewitt connection was a lifelong shadow. No matter how many times Hewitt denied paternity, the comparison remained. The cruel irony was that his mother's most human choice, seeking love outside a cold marriage, became the weapon used against her son. The whispers never left him. As he grew into adulthood, joined the military, and tried to forge his own path, the resemblance to Hewitt was brought up again and again, as though his very existence was evidence in a case he never asked to be part of. Even in recent years, Hewitt's name has not faded from the conversation. Every article about Harry's struggles, every tabloid speculation about his relationship with the royal family, seems to revive the same question. Is he really Charles's son? The persistence of this question underscores the lasting power of the Hewitt connection. It is not just about appearances. It is about what Hewitt represents. The possibility that Diana, the people's princess, left behind a legacy far more complicated than fairy tales would suggest. But perhaps the cruelest part of the Hewitt connection is that it reduced Harry to speculation. Instead of being seen as Diana's son, he was viewed as evidence, as a clue in a scandalous mystery. He was not judged for his character, his actions, or his choices, but for the color of his hair and the timing of an affair he had no part in. The connection turned his life into a riddle, one that followed him into adulthood and, eventually, drove him to seek answers through DNA. As the years passed, the Hewitt connection refused to die. Denials did little to stop it. Statements from the palace fell flat. What mattered was the story, and the story was too compelling for the public to let go. The dashing cavalry officer, the lonely princess, the red-haired boy. It was the perfect recipe for intrigue. And as long as it remained unresolved, it fueled the narrative of doubt that defined Harry's identity in the eyes of the world. The Hewitt connection was never just about James Hewitt. It was about Diana's loneliness, Charles's indifference, the monarchy's obsession with appearances, and the cruelty of a public eager to see scandal in every shadow. For Harry, it was the backdrop of his life, the whisper that became a roar, the shadow he could not escape. It was this connection, this relentless comparison, that made the eventual DNA revelation not just a scientific fact, but the closing of a wound that had been open for decades. The Hewitt connection lit the fire. But the flame would only grow hotter as Harry confronted his own childhood, where shadows of doubt began to intertwine with his earliest memories. The next chapter in this story is not about affairs or lovers. It is about a boy growing up in the shadow of whispers, trying to carve out his place in a family and a world that seemed determined to question whether he truly belonged. To understand the gravity of Harry's later revelations, one must return to his childhood, to those early years shaped not only by the weight of royal expectation, but also by the cruel undercurrent of suspicion about who he truly was. Childhood is supposed to be a sanctuary, a time of innocence where laughter drowns out worry. But for Harry, the palace was never just a home. It was a stage where every expression, every feature, and every choice was dissected, analyzed, and compared. And lingering beneath the surface of that gilded childhood was a question he never asked but could never escape. Did he truly belong? Harry was born in 1984, 2 years after William. From the beginning, comparisons between the brothers were inevitable. William was the heir, the golden boy whose every milestone was celebrated with pomp and pride. Harry, the so-called spare, occupied a role that was both privileged and cruel. He was close enough to the throne to live under relentless scrutiny, but never close enough to be embraced with the same reverence. While William's image was carefully polished for a future as king, Harry's was often painted as unruly, mischievous, and wild. This dichotomy was not accidental. It was born from the way the palace, the press, and even the public perceived the two boys. From the earliest photographs, people noticed differences. William's features seemed to align with the Windsor line. Fairer, more angular, resembling Charles in ways that reassured those obsessed with continuity. Harry's features stood apart. His bright red hair and softer facial structure fueled speculation. To most children, hair color is nothing more than a genetic roll of the dice. But for Harry, it was the beginning of whispers that would trail him for decades. He looks like Hewitt, some would say. These words, though spoken quietly by staff or printed brazenly in tabloids, would eventually find their way into the consciousness of the boy himself. School should have been a refuge, but even there, Harry could not escape the shadow of doubt. Classmates, emboldened by gossip they overheard from adults or read in sensational headlines, mocked him. Children are cruel in ways they often don't understand, repeating rumors without grasping the pain they cause. For Harry, playground taunts about who his real father might be cut deeper than most. He was not just a child teased about appearance. He was a prince, his very identity questioned by the world. While William carried the weight of being the heir, Harry bore the burden of being a question mark. At home, Diana tried to shield her boys from the worst of it. She was a devoted mother, determined to give them as normal a life as possible despite the trappings of royalty. She took them to theme parks, fast food restaurants, and on adventures meant to show them life outside the palace walls. Yet even her love could not erase the reality that Harry was growing up under a microscope. Diana's affection may have softened the blows, but it also raised questions Harry could not articulate. Why did his mother cling so tightly to him? Did she know something he didn't? Charles's relationship with Harry only deepened the sense of unease. Where William enjoyed moments of bonding with his father, Harry often seemed to receive a colder version of paternal care. Accounts from insiders described Charles as distant with both boys, but particularly aloof with Harry. Jokes were reportedly made at Harry's expense, suggesting he was the spare or not truly one of them. Whether these words were said in jest or bitterness, to a child, they carried a sting that lingered. Each offhand remark reinforced the whispers Harry was already beginning to hear outside the palace walls. As Harry grew older, his personality began to form in contrast to William's. Where William was measured, Harry was impulsive. Where William was polished, Harry was raw. The press painted him as a troublemaker, the rebellious prince who stumbled out of nightclubs and courted scandal. While some of this reputation was exaggerated by a hungry media, there was truth in Harry's struggle. He was a young man searching for identity in a world that constantly questioned his. Was his rebellion a natural part of his character? Or was it a response to the deep-seated insecurity planted in his childhood? To Harry, it may have felt like both. Consider the weight of growing up constantly compared not only to your brother, but also to a man you had never met. Every glance in the mirror was a reminder of the whispers. Every article that speculated about his paternity deepened the wound. Unlike most children, Harry had no escape from the public narrative that consumed his life. Even when he laughed, when he smiled, when he showed glimpses of joy, there was always someone ready to interpret those expressions as signs of his true father. Diana's death in 1997 only magnified the shadows. At just 12 years old, Harry lost the one person who had shielded him most fiercely from the cruelty of speculation. Walking behind her coffin, cameras capturing every tear and every step, he was not only grieving his mother, but also stepping into a world that had just become colder. Without Diana, the whispers grew louder. She had been his protector, his confidant, the one who might have eventually told him the truth, or at least softened it. Her absence left him vulnerable, not just emotionally, but existentially. He was now alone with the doubts that had been whispered all his life. The years that followed saw Harry spiral in ways that seemed almost inevitable. His teenage rebellion, his experimentation, his clashes with the press. These were not simply the antics of a privileged prince. They were cries from a young man struggling to define himself in a family and a world that refused to let him. He wanted to belong, yet he was constantly reminded that maybe he did not. He wanted to be seen as his own man, yet he was continually defined by comparisons, to William, to Charles, to Hewitt. The shadow of doubt had shaped him in ways few outside the palace walls could truly understand. But even amid the rebellion, there was resilience. Harry's decision to join the military was, in many ways, his attempt to escape the whispers and forge an identity of his own. In uniform, he was not just a prince, he was a soldier. He found camaraderie, purpose, and a sense of belonging that had eluded him in royal life. Yet even there, the questions followed him. Headlines about his missions, his role, his bravery, were often accompanied by the same cruel speculation. Whose son was he really? This constant shadow shaped not just Harry's public image, but his inner world. Psychologists often speak of identity crises, the struggle to answer the question, who am I? For Harry, this question was not metaphorical. It was literal. Who was he? Was he truly a Windsor? Or was he, as the whispers claimed, the son of another man entirely? These questions, planted in childhood, grew with him into adulthood, influencing his choices, his relationships, and ultimately, his decision to seek the truth. The tragedy of Harry's childhood lies in its paradox. He was raised in palaces, surrounded by wealth and privilege, yet deprived of the one thing every child deserves: certainty about where he belonged. The shadow of doubt cast by whispers of his paternity was not something he could outrun, no matter how far he traveled or how hard he tried to define himself. It followed him from the nursery to the playground, from classrooms to the battlefield, until it became a part of him. Looking back, it is clear that Harry's childhood was marked not only by loss and privilege, but also by the burden of a secret he did not know he carried. The shadow of doubt was always there, shaping his laughter, his rebellion, his grief, and his choices. And though the truth would not be confirmed until years later, the boy had already lived with its weight for a lifetime. Every life reaches a moment where the weight of past wounds collides with the present, forcing choices that shape the future. For Prince Harry, that moment came in the turbulence of his late teens and 20s. The boy who grew up in the shadow of whispers became a man struggling to outrun them. His life was no longer protected by childhood innocence, nor softened by Diana's maternal shield. He was alone, navigating grief, doubt, and the relentless pressure of being a royal under scrutiny. And yet, it was in these years of rebellion and pain that the seeds of his eventual quest for truth were planted. Harry's struggles were not hidden. Unlike many royals who maintained the polished veneer of perfection, Harry's mistakes played out in the public eye. Tabloids devoured every misstep, splashing his youthful indiscretions across front pages. Photographs of a young prince stumbling out of nightclubs, stories of underage drinking, whispers of drug use. All of these became ammunition for a press eager to reinforce the image of Harry as the wild one. While William was praised for his steadiness, Harry was cast as the reckless spare. To the world, it seemed like a simple case of personality difference. But to those who understood the deeper currents of his life, Harry's rebellion was not just defiance, it was pain. Grief lay at the core of his struggles. The loss of Diana at age 12 was not something Harry could easily process. Walking behind her coffin in front of millions was not a private moment of mourning, but a public display of stoicism expected of a prince. That trauma lingered, unaddressed, unhealed. Psychologists have often noted that unprocessed grief manifests in destructive behaviors, and Harry was no exception. His rebellion was less about privilege and more about coping with wounds left untreated. He once admitted in interviews that he spent years refusing to think about his mother's death, burying the pain in distractions and reckless acts. But beneath that grief was another wound, more insidious, born from the whispers of his paternity. As Harry entered adolescence, he became more aware of the speculations surrounding his identity. He could no longer dismiss it as childish taunts or cruel jokes. He read the headlines, saw the comparisons to James Hewitt, and felt the sting of knowing that millions questioned whether he truly belonged. For a teenager already navigating grief, this suspicion was devastating. How could he build confidence in himself when the world insisted he might be a fraud, an outsider within his own family? His strained relationship with Charles added to the turmoil. While William found a sense of purpose in preparing for kingship, Harry struggled to find his place. Charles, often preoccupied with his own public image, and Camilla, seemed emotionally distant. Reports suggest that Harry felt overlooked, sometimes dismissed, as though he were an afterthought in the family narrative. When he acted out, it was often met with criticism rather than compassion. To Harry, it must have seemed as though even his father, whether by blood or not, was unwilling to see the pain behind the behavior. It was during his military years that Harry found a glimpse of escape from the chaos. Joining the British Army gave him structure, camaraderie, and a sense of purpose he had long craved. In uniform, he was not just a prince, but a soldier, one among many. He trained, he fought, he risked his life alongside comrades who judged him not for his titles or his parentage, but for his courage. For a time, the military gave him an identity that was his own. But even there, the shadows followed. Headlines questioning his assignments, suggesting he was given special treatment, once again dragged his sense of legitimacy into the spotlight. The whispers of Hewitt resurfaced, as though no matter what he did, his entire existence was still reduced to speculation about his bloodline. The turning point came as Harry began to recognize that his struggles could not be silenced by distraction. His public scandals were not enough to numb the inner conflict. His military career, while fulfilling, did not erase the doubts that gnawed at him. The unresolved questions about his mother, his father, and his identity demanded answers. And in those years, as he tried to balance duty with personal freedom, Harry began to confront the truth that had haunted him since childhood. He needed to know who he truly was. It was also during this time that his relationship with Meghan Markle began to form. Meghan's presence in Harry's life was transformative, not only because of their love, but because she encouraged him to face the parts of himself he had long ignored. Meghan, an outsider to the royal system, saw the monarchy not as sacred but as suffocating. She questioned its traditions, its silences, and its secrets. And she pushed Harry to question them too. For the first time, Harry had a partner who not only understood his pain, but also urged him to confront it head-on. This was no small influence. Where others told him to keep quiet, Meghan urged him to speak. Where others told him to accept, she urged him to challenge. And where others dismissed the whispers of his paternity as tabloid gossip, she treated them as questions worth answering. But before Meghan, there were years where Harry stumbled through pain alone. His reputation as the party prince was both shield and prison. It gave him a way to act out, to release his anger, but it also reinforced the perception that he was unstable, unfit, or unworthy. The irony was cruel. The very behavior born from his unresolved identity crisis was used to undermine him further. Each headline of scandal became another reminder that he could not escape the shadow cast over his life. The public watched with fascination, often with cruelty, as Harry struggled. To some, he was a spoiled prince squandering privilege. To others, he was a tragic figure, the boy who lost his mother too young and never recovered. But what few understood was that Harry's struggles were not just about grief or rebellion. They were about identity. Every reckless night, every fight with the press, every clash with his family traced back to the same unspoken question: who am I, really? This turning point in Harry's life was not about one scandal or one decision. It was about the realization that the whispers were not going away. They had followed him from childhood into adulthood, shaping his choices and his reputation. And now, as he stood on the edge of building a life with Meghan, he knew he could not carry those doubts into the future. If he was to be a husband, a father, and a man free of the chains of speculation, he needed answers. The struggles of his youth had prepared him for this moment. The grief, the rebellion, the military discipline, the public humiliation, they were all steps on a path that led to a single, unavoidable decision: to confront the truth head-on. The turning point was not a dramatic outburst or a single revelation. It was a quiet acknowledgement within Harry himself that he could no longer live in the shadow of doubt. The time had come to seek certainty, whatever the cost. And so, the boy once mocked for his red hair, the man once ridiculed as the party prince, began the journey that would redefine his life. The turning point of struggle had passed. What lay ahead was a reckoning, one that would involve Meghan, the monarchy, and, ultimately, the scientific truth of a DNA test. By the time Meghan Markle entered Harry's life, he had already weathered decades of grief, scandal, and whispers that refused to die. He was a man shaped by trauma, hardened by scrutiny, and yet softened by the compassion he inherited from his mother. Meghan did not simply fall in love with Harry the Prince. She met Harry the wounded man, the one searching for identity beyond crowns and ceremonies. And it was her presence, her voice, and her perspective as an outsider that shifted the course of Harry's journey. Where others told him to bury his doubts, Meghan encouraged him to dig them up. Where others demanded silence, she urged truth. In this chapter of Harry's life, Meghan's influence became the catalyst for the reckoning he had avoided for so long. Meghan's arrival in the royal story was disruptive from the start. An American actress, biracial, divorced, and outspoken, she embodied everything the monarchy had historically resisted. She did not fit the mold of a royal bride groomed to blend into tradition. Instead, she was independent, ambitious, and unafraid to ask uncomfortable questions. For Harry, who had spent his life stifled by protocol and whispers, her confidence was magnetic. She did not look at the monarchy with reverence. She saw it for what it was, an institution built on image, secrecy, and rules designed to protect power rather than people. And through her eyes, Harry began to reassess everything he had once accepted as a movable truth. Their conversations in the early days of their relationship were said to be deeply honest. Meghan, unfamiliar with the sacred aura that surrounded the Windsors, asked questions Harry had long been afraid to confront. Why did he and William receive such different treatment from their father? Why was Harry constantly portrayed as unstable in the media? Why did the rumors about James Hewitt persist if they weren't true? Meghan's questions were not cruel. They were curious, probing, and born from her instinct to understand the man she loved. But to Harry, they were also unsettling, because they touched the very core of his deepest insecurity. For most of his life, Harry had lived with an unspoken pact. He would not address the rumors, and in return, those around him would pretend not to hear them. It was a fragile silence that allowed him to function. But Meghan broke that silence, not out of malice, but out of love. She could see the way the whispers haunted him, the way his grief and anger often burst out in ways he could not control. And she believed that facing the truth, however painful, was the only way for Harry to heal. Meghan's curiosity extended beyond Harry's personal pain. It also reflected her own struggle with identity. As a biracial woman navigating Hollywood and later the monarchy, she understood what it felt like to have your legitimacy questioned. She too knew the sting of being told you didn't belong, of being measured against standards you never agreed to. In this shared struggle, she and Harry found common ground. Her encouragement for him to pursue answers was not just about curiosity, it was about solidarity. She wanted him to free himself from the shackles of doubt the same way she sought to free herself from the suffocating grip of royal expectations. Insiders later suggested that Meghan's push for truth was one of the defining elements of their relationship. In private conversations, she reportedly asked Harry why he had never sought definitive answers through DNA testing. For Meghan, who was practical and modern, the idea seemed obvious. Science could silence decades of rumors in a way no palace statement or tabloid denial ever could. For Harry, the suggestion was terrifying. A DNA test could confirm what he had long feared. It could prove that the whispers were not just gossip, but fact. Taking such a step meant risking everything he knew about himself, his family, and his place in history. Yet Meghan's influence lay in her ability to frame this not as a risk, but as liberation. Wouldn't you rather know than always wonder? Was the kind of question she posed. She saw how much energy Harry expended fighting the shadows of rumor, how much pain he carried from never knowing for sure. For her, truth was not something to fear. It was something to embrace, even if it hurt. She believed that only through truth could they build a life together free from the ghosts of the past. This encouragement came at a time when Harry was already feeling alienated from the royal family. Meghan's arrival had intensified divisions within the institution, and Harry found himself caught between loyalty to the monarchy and loyalty to his wife. The press was relentless, painting Meghan as manipulative, ambitious, and even dangerous. To Harry, these attacks echoed the cruelty once inflicted on Diana, and he was determined not to let history repeat itself. In defending Meghan, he found his own voice. And in finding that voice, he realized he could no longer ignore the questions about his identity. If he could stand up to the institution for her, why couldn't he stand up to it for himself? It was Meghan's role as both partner and challenger that made her influence so profound. She loved Harry fiercely, but she also refused to let him hide behind the excuses he had carried for years. She reminded him that the past would always haunt him until he confronted it. Their private conversations, late at night in Montecito or whispered during their time in London, circled back to the same question. What if the rumors were true? What if his life, his identity, his lineage had been built on a secret Diana took to her grave? For Harry, Meghan's influence was both terrifying and empowering. On one hand, it forced him to confront the possibility of losing everything he thought he knew. On the other, it gave him the courage to consider a future where he was no longer defined by shadows. Meghan's curiosity was not idle, it was urgent. She knew that for Harry to heal, he needed to face the truth, however painful. And so, with her by his side, he began to consider what he had once dismissed as unthinkable, taking a DNA test. This turning point was not a sudden decision, but a gradual shift. Meghan's persistence, her compassion, and her outsider's perspective chipped away at the defenses Harry had built since childhood. For decades, he had tried to outrun the whispers. Now, for the first time, he began to consider confronting them head-on. The influence of Meghan was not about pushing him into rebellion. It was about guiding him toward liberation. She believed that truth was the only foundation strong enough for the life they wanted to build together. And so, Harry stood on the brink of a decision that would change everything. Meghan's influence had led him here, to the edge of revelation. The next step would be his to take. To order the test, to wait for the results, to risk the possibility that his entire life had been built on a lie. But with Meghan's encouragement, the fear was no longer paralyzing. It was now a challenge, one he felt ready to face. In the story of Harry's search for identity, Meghan's role cannot be overstated. She was the mirror that reflected his pain, the voice that questioned his silence, the partner who believed he could be more than the shadow of whispers. Without her influence, Harry might have continued to live with doubt, burying the question until it consumed him. With her, he found the courage to seek the truth. And that truth, once revealed, would not only redefine him, but shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. There comes a moment in every life when running is no longer an option, when the questions that have haunted you demand an answer no matter the cost. For Prince Harry, that moment arrived not in the roar of a scandal, nor in the public eye, but in the quiet intimacy of private reflection, sharpened by Meghan's persistence and his own restless conscience. After years of whispers, comparisons, and ridicule, Harry made the decision to seek the truth through a DNA test. It was a choice that would not only change how he viewed himself, but also reshape his relationship with the royal family and the public forever. For Harry, the decision was agonizing. He had lived with suspicion his entire life, but suspicion allowed for hope. As long as the whispers remained unproven, he could dismiss them, bury them, or fight them off. A DNA test would remove that ambiguity. It would provide an answer so final, so irreversible, that his identity could never be shielded again. What he had feared as a boy, what had wounded him as a teenager, what had haunted him as a man, all of it would collapse into one undeniable truth. It was Meghan who helped him understand that living in doubt was already a kind of prison. She reminded him that uncertainty had stolen too much from him already. His childhood had been marred by taunts, his adulthood shadowed by speculation. Every time a tabloid printed Hewitt's name beside his, every time strangers whispered about his red hair, every time Charles treated him with coldness, the question grew louder. Meghan asked him if he wanted to pass that same doubt on to his children. Would Archie and Lilibet grow up hearing the same whispers about their father that he had endured? Could he face them one day and say he never sought the truth? The gravity of the decision weighed on Harry in ways few could comprehend. To most, a DNA test is a private matter, a question of parentage that affects a small circle of people. But for Harry, the stakes were monumental. He was not just a son seeking answers. He was a prince, a royal whose very legitimacy was tied to bloodline. If the test proved that Charles was not his biological father, the consequences would stretch beyond his own life. It would shake the institution that had governed Britain for centuries, undermine the continuity of the monarchy, and expose secrets the royal family had buried for decades. The secrecy surrounding the test was paramount. Harry could not simply walk into a clinic and request it. Every move he made was tracked, every action scrutinized. If word leaked that he was seeking a DNA test, the media firestorm would be uncontrollable. Arrangements had to be made quietly, with trusted medical professionals who understood the magnitude of confidentiality. This was not just about science. It was about survival. One wrong step, one careless word, and the truth would explode before he was ready to face it. In those days leading up to the test, Harry's emotions oscillated between fear and determination. Fear, because he understood that the result could fracture the fragile ties he still had to his family. Determination, because he knew he could no longer live shackled to doubt. He spent long nights replaying his childhood memories, searching for signs, trying to read meaning into every cold glance from Charles, every affectionate gesture from Diana. He wondered whether his mother had wanted him to discover the truth or whether she had hoped he would never know. He thought of her confessions, her letters, her love for Hewitt, and he realized that the answer had always been waiting for him. It was he who had refused to seek it. The decision also revealed the fracture between Harry and the institution. The monarchy thrives on silence and image, on pretending that problems do not exist. For Harry to pursue the truth was to defy that unspoken rule. It was an act of rebellion not just against his father, but against the entire system that had silenced Diana and sought to silence him. In that sense, the DNA test was more than a personal choice. It was a declaration of independence. He would no longer allow the monarchy, the press, or even his own fears to dictate his identity. Waiting for the test to be arranged, Harry confided in Meghan about his nightmares. He imagined both possibilities, each carrying its own pain. If Charles was confirmed as his father, then the years of whispers would remain a cruel wound inflicted without cause. But if Hewitt was revealed as his biological father, then the whispers would no longer be rumor. They would be fact, and his entire life as a Windsor would be exposed as a lie. Which was worse, the humiliation of living under suspicion or the devastation of confirmed betrayal? Meghan's answer was steady. She told him that truth, no matter how painful, was always better than silence. She believed that knowing who he was, even if it was not what he expected, would finally give him the freedom he had long been denied. And so, Harry clung to that belief, even as his heart trembled with dread. The day of the test itself was cloaked in secrecy. Few knew where it was conducted, and those who did would never dare reveal it. Harry submitted his DNA sample with a mixture of resignation and courage, knowing that this small act would change the course of his life. The sample was clinical, detached, almost too ordinary for the enormity of what it represented. And then came the waiting. Days that stretched into weeks, each one a torment. Harry carried on with his life, but every moment was marked by the weight of what was coming. During that waiting period, Harry often found himself thinking of Diana. He remembered her warmth, her laughter, the way she had shielded him from the coldness of palace life. He wondered if she had known this moment would one day come. He imagined her voice telling him to be brave, to face the truth with the same courage she once displayed when she defied the monarchy on live television. In her memory, he found strength. When the results finally came, Harry hesitated before opening them. The envelope represented the answer to a lifetime of doubt. For hours, he stared at it, afraid to confirm the truth he had both dreaded and sought. Finally, with Meghan by his side, he opened it. And in that moment, his world collapsed. The results confirmed what whispers had long suggested. Charles was not his biological father. The man who had raised him with distance, but also with duty, was not bound to him by blood. The rumors, the headlines, the cruel taunts, all of them were no longer speculation. They were truth. The decision to take the test had been Harry's alone, but the impact of the result extended far beyond him. It touched his children, who would one day ask about their lineage. It touched Meghan, who had stood by him through the storm. It touched William, who now faced the reality that his brother was not only emotionally distanced from the monarchy, but biologically outside of it. And it touched Charles, whose silence and distance suddenly carried a new, devastating meaning. The DNA test decision was the turning point in Harry's life. It was the moment when doubt ended and truth began, no matter how painful. It was the moment when whispers turned into certainty, when a lifetime of speculation became fact. And in that moment, Harry understood that his life would never be the same again. There are moments in life when time seems to stop, when the air grows heavy, and every sound fades into silence. For Prince Harry, the revelation of the DNA results was one of those moments. After decades of whispers, speculation, and cruel jokes, the truth stood before him in black and white, clinical and undeniable. King Charles was not his biological father. A lifetime of suspicion had crystallized into fact. In that instant, the fragile scaffolding of his identity collapsed, leaving him staring into an abyss of questions that would forever change the way he saw himself, his family, and the monarchy. When Harry first read the results, shock gripped him like a vice. He had braced himself for either outcome, telling himself he was ready, but the human heart is never prepared for such devastation. His entire life had been lived under the banner of Windsor, shaped by royal duty and public expectation. Now, in one moment, all of it felt like a lie. The man he had called father, the man who had raised him, albeit at a distance, was not bound to him by blood. The man his mother had loved outside her marriage, James Hewitt, was now proven to be the source of the features that had set him apart for so long. Tears came easily. Megan, by his side, wrapped him in her arms as he wept, not just for himself, but for Diana, for the years of silence, for the child who had endured cruel taunts without knowing the truth. These were not the tears of weakness. They were the tears of release, of a lifetime's worth of doubt finally finding resolution. But with resolution came a pain sharper than any rumor, certainty. There would be no more pretending, no more dismissing whispers as gossip. The truth was now written, immutable and unforgiving. The revelation was more than personal, it was seismic. For Harry, it meant a complete unraveling of the narrative he had lived. For William, it meant confronting the reality that the brother he had defended all his life was not, in fact, his full sibling by blood. For Charles, it meant facing the devastating confirmation of what had been whispered for decades, that the boy he had raised under the royal banner was not truly his son. For the monarchy, it meant the collapse of an image carefully preserved for generations. Harry's emotions after reading the results were a storm of contradictions. He felt grief for the child inside him who had never truly belonged. He felt rage at the institution that had allowed him to suffer under suspicion without offering him the truth. He felt betrayal from a mother he adored, whose silence now seemed like a haunting choice. And yet, beneath the grief and the rage, he also felt clarity. For the first time, the uncertainty was gone. The whispers that had followed him through schoolyards, tabloids, and adulthood had been silenced by science. He finally knew who he was, even if the answer shattered him. The revelation also forced him to rethink every memory of Charles. The coldness, the distance, the rare moments of kindness. All of it was now colored by the knowledge that Charles had perhaps always known, or at least suspected, that Harry was not his biological son. Every offhand remark, every lapse in affection, every joke about being the spare took on new weight. Harry could not help but wonder, had Charles treated him differently because he knew? Had his place in the family always been conditional, tolerated but not fully embraced? These questions tore at him in the days following the revelation, gnawing at his fragile sense of belonging. William's reaction, too, haunted him. Though Harry had not yet told his brother, he could already imagine the devastation. William, bound by duty and loyalty to the crown, would be torn between compassion for his brother and fear of the scandal's impact on the monarchy. Would William see Harry differently? Would he still call him brother with the same love? Or would bloodlines fracture the bond they had shared since childhood? For Harry, the anticipation of William's response was almost as painful as the revelation itself. In the quiet after the storm, Harry found himself thinking of Diana. Her love, her laughter, her warmth, they had been the foundation of his life. But now he wondered how much of her love had been laced with guilt, how many times she had looked into his eyes and seen not just her son, but the secret she carried. Had she intended to tell him one day? Or had she hoped the truth would remain buried forever, hidden behind palace walls and royal silence? These unanswered questions deepened the ache of her absence. More than ever, Harry longed to speak to her, to ask her why she chose silence, to hear her reassure him that he was more than the scandal of his birth. The revelation also had practical implications. Harry was no longer just a man with a personal crisis. He was a public figure whose entire existence had been tied to the monarchy. If Charles was not his father, what did that mean for his titles, his place in the line of succession, his children's standing? The monarchy is built on blood, on the unbroken continuity of lineage. Harry's revelation threatened to tear at that foundation. Though he had already stepped back from royal duties, the truth of his parentage could still reverberate through the institution in ways no abdication ever had. But beyond politics and titles, the revelation was deeply human. It was the story of a son stripped of certainty, of a man forced to rebuild his identity from the ruins of truth. Harry's tears were not for the loss of privilege or titles. They were for the boy who had grown up mocked for his red hair, who had wondered in silence, who had craved his father's affection, who had walked behind his mother's coffin with the world watching. They were for the man who had carried whispers like chains, only to find that those chains were real, all along. And yet, even in the depths of despair, the revelation carried a strange kind of liberation. The truth was painful, but it was also final. The ambiguity that had tormented him for decades was gone. The shadows that had stalked his life had given way to clarity. Now, at last, he could stop wondering. He could stop asking who he was. The answer might be devastating, but it was his. The revelation marked a before and after in Harry's life. Before, he was the prince defined by whispers. After, he was the man defined by truth. It was a transformation no crown, no title, no ceremony could bestow. It was the brutal gift of certainty. In the days that followed, Harry struggled to imagine how to move forward, how to tell William, how to face Charles, how to live with a truth that would shake not only his family but the world. But one thing was certain, there was no going back. The revelation had changed everything. The boy in the shadow of doubt was gone. In his place stood a man with a truth too powerful to ignore, and a future forever altered by the words on a sheet of paper. If the revelation of Harry's DNA test shattered his world, its ripple effects were destined to collide with the one person bound to him most deeply, his brother, Prince William. Their bond had always been complicated, a mix of brotherly love and rivalry, of shared trauma and diverging paths. They were the two sons of Diana, united in grief after her death, yet divided by the roles the monarchy had cast upon them. One heir, one spare. For William, the news that Charles was not Harry's biological father was not just a family matter. It was a seismic shift that threatened to unmoor the very foundations of everything he had been raised to protect. When Harry finally told William, the conversation was raw and painful. It was not delivered in the form of a headline or a leaked report, but as a brother's confession. Harry, still reeling from the results, knew he could not hide the truth from the one person who had walked beside him through every storm. He sat across from William, perhaps in a private room away from the ears of courtiers, and laid out the findings. There were no dramatic flourishes, no accusations, just the cold reality of science, and the tears of a brother who had lost his sense of self. For William, the words landed like thunder. At first, disbelief surged. He had spent his entire life brushing off rumors about Harry's paternity, defending his younger brother in conversations both public and private. He had consoled Harry when the whispers hurt, assured him that they were nonsense, that the family's love was what mattered. Now, all those reassurances seemed to dissolve into ashes. The rumors he had fought against were no longer whispers, but truth, verified by evidence Harry could not deny. William's immediate reaction was shock, followed quickly by anger, not at Harry, but at the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Anger at the tabloids that had exploited the story for decades. Anger at the institution that had allowed suspicion to fester. Anger, perhaps most of all, at Diana, whose choices had set this chain of events in motion. He adored his mother and defended her memory with fierce loyalty, but the revelation forced him to see her not only as the people's princess, but as a woman who had carried secrets with devastating consequences. Grief, too, filled William's heart. In one revelation, his brother's place in his life shifted. They were still brothers, but now not in the way he had always believed. Half-brothers, bound by their mother but not by their father. The realization gnawed at William, challenging the very foundation of his identity as well. If his brother was not a Windsor, what did that mean for their shared childhood, their shared grief, their shared struggle against the pressures of the crown? Could love alone be enough to bridge the fracture that bloodlines had carved between them? And yet, despite the turmoil, William's protective instinct remained. He saw the devastation in Harry's eyes, the tears that refused to stop, the weight of truth crushing him. In that moment, duty and anger fell away, replaced by brotherly compassion. Whatever the test had revealed, Harry was still the boy who had stood beside him at Diana's funeral, still the brother he had laughed with in their mother's arms, still the man he loved despite years of conflict. William may have been shaken, but he could not abandon Harry in his pain. The challenge for William, however, was greater than private loyalty. He was not only a brother, he was the future king. His reaction had to balance personal grief with the responsibilities of monarchy. The revelation threatened not just Harry's identity, but the stability of the crown itself. If the truth became public, It would ignite a scandal unprecedented in modern royal history. Questions about succession, legitimacy, and the future of the monarchy would explode. For William, whose life had been devoted to safeguarding the institution, the revelation was more than a family tragedy. It was a constitutional nightmare. This dual burden tore at him. On one side was his brother, broken and searching for understanding. On the other was the monarchy, fragile and dependent on appearances. William knew the press could not be allowed to discover the truth. He urged Harry to protect the secret, not for Charles, not even for the monarchy, but for survival. Once released, the truth could never be contained. The family would be consumed, their mother's legacy stained, and the crown weakened at a time when its relevance was already under fire. Harry, however, saw things differently. For him, the revelation was liberation. Keeping it secret would only replicate the silences that had destroyed Diana. Where William sought protection, Harry sought honesty. This divergence exposed the growing rift between them, not in love, but in vision. William believed survival depended on silence. Harry believed healing depended on truth. Both positions came from love, one for family, the other for self. But they pulled the brothers in opposite directions. William's anguish grew in the days after the revelation. Alone, he replayed memories of Diana with Harry, searching for signs he had missed. He thought of the way she doted on Harry, her fierce protectiveness, her refusal to let the monarchy crush his spirit. Did she love him more because she knew the truth? Did her affection carry the guilt of a secret she could never reveal? These questions haunted William, adding another layer of grief to a truth he had never wanted to face. In private, William confronted Charles as well. Their conversation was tense, filled with unspoken accusations. Did Charles know? Had he always suspected? Was his coldness toward Harry the result of doubt or of silent knowledge? Charles, bound by his own pride and fear, offered no clear answers. For William, this silence was infuriating. It seemed the monarchy's instinct for secrecy had once again destroyed trust within the family. Despite his inner turmoil, William's public face remained steady. He appeared at events with the same composure, the same careful smile. But behind closed doors, his world was unraveling. His brother was broken, his father shrouded in silence, his mother's legacy complicated by truths he could not deny. William stood at the center of a storm, pulled between duty and love, between silence and truth. And yet, through all of it, one thing remained constant. William's bond with Harry, though tested, did not break. He could not change the truth of the DNA test. He could not undo Diana's choices. He could not shield the monarchy from the scandal forever. But he could stand beside his brother, as he had in grief, as he had in childhood. In that commitment lay the fragile hope that love could outlast even the harshest revelations. Still, the question lingered. How long could such a truth remain hidden? Secrets, once revealed, have a way of demanding light. And as William grappled with his private pain, the storm outside the palace walls was already gathering, preparing to turn whispers into headlines once more. For King Charles, the revelation of Harry's DNA test was not just a family crisis, but a reckoning decades in the making. In the solitude of his chambers, beneath the weight of centuries of monarchy and the cold eyes of portraits of past kings, he was forced to confront the truth he had long suspected, perhaps even known, but never dared to speak aloud. The results were undeniable. Harry, the boy he had watched grow into a man, the son he had raised in duty but not in warmth, was not his by blood. The dilemma for Charles was not merely paternal. It was constitutional, emotional, and existential. How does a king reconcile the truth that his own son is not truly his? And more importantly, how does he protect the monarchy from a scandal that could burn it to ashes? For years, Charles had deflected the whispers with silence. When Diana's affair with James Hewitt became public, he clung to the timeline, that Harry had been born before their relationship began. He let palace spokesmen repeat it, let courtiers push it as fact. But in private, the doubts lingered. Harry's features, his hair, his disposition, they fueled questions Charles never asked aloud, but carried quietly in his heart. Perhaps in moments of bitterness during his crumbling marriage, he had even allowed himself to wonder if the rumors were true. But he had never sought confirmation. For Charles, not knowing was safer than knowing. Ignorance allowed him to maintain the facade, to play the role of father without confronting the possibility that it was all a lie. Now, with the DNA results in Harry's hands, ignorance was no longer an option. The truth had been unearthed, and Charles could no longer avoid it. His dilemma was agonizing. Should he acknowledge it, admit to Harry, and perhaps even to the public that he was not his father? Or should he double down on silence, preserving the monarchy by denying what science had proven? To Charles, the choice was not simply about personal pride, but about the survival of an institution that had already weathered too many storms. The monarchy's foundation is bloodline. For centuries, its legitimacy has rested on the claim of unbroken descent. Kings and queens have ruled not because of their merit, but because of who their parents were. Charles knew that if the truth about Harry's parentage became public, it would be more than a personal scandal. It would be a constitutional crisis. Harry's position in the line of succession, his titles, his children's legitimacy, all would be thrown into doubt. Worse, the revelation would confirm what critics of the monarchy had long claimed, that behind the gilded facade lies dysfunction, secrecy, and deception. But Charles's dilemma was not only about the crown. It was also about Harry himself. For all his coldness, for all the distance that had marked their relationship, Charles had still raised Harry. He had paid for his education, guided his career in the military, and stood with him at Diana's funeral. Blood or no blood, Harry was his son in the eyes of the world. Yet the DNA test forced Charles to ask, had he ever truly loved Harry as a son, or had the doubts always poisoned that love? The question gnawed at him, tearing open old wounds from a marriage defined by betrayal and unhappiness. Charles's emotions, though rarely visible in public, were tumultuous. There was shame that he had failed to give Diana the love she needed, driving her into Hewitt's arms. There was resentment that Diana's choices had left him raising a child who was not his own, all while the world speculated about it openly. And there was grief that the boy he had tried, however imperfectly, to father was now lost to him in a way he could never repair. The DNA test did not just confirm a truth. It shattered the fragile story he had told himself for decades. In the days following the revelation, Charles withdrew into his inner circle. Courtiers, ever pragmatic, advised silence. The monarchy's survival, they argued, depended on denying the truth. Science might say one thing, but as long as the palace refused to acknowledge it, doubt could still be cast. Publicly, nothing needed to change. Harry had already stepped back from royal duties, already distanced himself from the crown. Why fan the flames of scandal by admitting what need not be spoken? To them, silence was survival. But Charles's heart was not so easily soothed. He thought of his legacy, of how history would remember him. Would he be the king who reigned quietly, or the king whose reign collapsed under the weight of scandal? Would he be remembered as a father who embraced his son despite the truth, or as a monarch who sacrificed love for duty? His dilemma was the eternal conflict of the crown. The personal versus the political, the human heart versus the demands of the throne. Privately, Charles may have considered confronting Harry, to look him in the eye and acknowledge the truth, to offer some measure of comfort, to tell him that blood does not erase the years they had lived as father and son. But pride held him back. To admit the truth to Harry would be to admit failure, not only as a husband, but as a man and as a king. Charles, long trained to suppress emotion, chose distance instead. The silence between them grew, thick with unspoken words neither could bring themselves to say. For William, watching his father wrestle with the dilemma was painful. He urged Charles to show Harry compassion, to step beyond the rigid boundaries of monarchy and offer him the love he so desperately needed. But Charles, torn between the instinct for control and the call of his conscience, struggled to act. His reign was still fragile, his approval still contested. Could he risk throwing gasoline on the fire of public scrutiny by acknowledging what Harry had discovered? Could he afford to humanize himself at the expense of the crown? And yet, the dilemma could not be ignored forever. Secrets, once revealed, rarely stay confined. Harry now carried the truth, and Charles knew his son well enough to understand that silence was not his nature. Diana's blood flowed in Harry's veins, and with it, her defiance, her willingness to challenge the monarchy's rigid rules. If Harry chose to speak publicly, the scandal would be unstoppable. Charles's only hope was to contain it, to appeal to Harry's sense of family, to persuade him that silence was the better path. But could he truly ask his son to bury the truth after it had already cost him so much? The king's dilemma was profound. Acknowledge the truth and risk the monarchy, or deny it and risk losing his son forever. For Charles, there was no good answer, only a choice between two devastating paths. Each night, as he sat alone with the weight of his crown, he thought of Diana. He thought of her laughter, her rebellion, her confessions. He thought of the way she had exposed the monarchy's secrets in her Panorama interview, and he feared Harry would follow the same path. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was that in Harry's defiance, he saw Diana's spirit alive again, a spirit that once threatened to undo him, and now threatened to undo the crown itself. The DNA test had given Harry certainty, but for Charles, it left only torment. A king caught between truth and survival, a father caught between pride and love, a man caught between the shadow of his past and the uncertainty of his future. The dilemma was not whether the truth mattered. It was how long he could keep it from burning everything he had sworn to protect. The revelation of Harry's DNA results did not remain a private wound contained within a few guarded hearts. It was a tidal wave that threatened to engulf the entire royal household, shaking its foundations and forcing its members into a crisis unlike anything they had faced before. The monarchy has weathered wars, abdications, divorces, and scandals, but the truth about bloodlines cuts deeper than any political storm. It is the monarchy's lifeblood, the one thing it cannot survive without. Now, with Harry holding proof that Charles was not his biological father, the family stood on the edge of collapse. The first tremors of crisis began inside the palace walls. Courtiers who had spent their lives managing scandals knew this was not one they could spin away with clever press releases. Infidelity could be forgiven, divorces tolerated, even financial mismanagement excused. But illegitimacy at the heart of the royal line threatened the monarchy's very claim to power. To acknowledge it would mean acknowledging that one of Diana's sons, a prince of the realm, was not truly of Windsor blood. That fact alone could unravel centuries of carefully maintained tradition. Within days, the household was consumed by hushed meetings and frantic debates. Advisors to the king urged silence. They reminded Charles that Harry had already stepped back from royal duties, that his role in the monarchy was diminished. If the truth could be contained within the family, perhaps it would never need to reach the public. But others feared Harry himself. He had grown increasingly vocal about his grievances with the crown, and unlike William, he no longer saw silence as survival. The fear was not that the press would uncover the DNA results. It was that Harry would choose to speak. Camilla played her own part in the crisis. Long despised by many as the other woman in Charles and Diana's marriage, she had fought for years to rehabilitate her image. Now, she watched with alarm as the scandal threatened to undo all her work. Insiders reported that she urged Charles to stand firm, to protect the monarchy at all costs, even if it meant distancing further from Harry. In her eyes, the survival of the crown outweighed the pain of one broken prince. For Harry, who had never warmed to her presence, Camilla's influence only deepened his sense of betrayal. The Queen's legacy, too, cast a long shadow over the crisis. Though Elizabeth II was gone, her example still weighed heavily on the family. She had embodied the mantra of silence and duty, of never explaining, never complaining. Some argued that her approach should be carried forward. Ignore the truth, project stability, and trust that time would blunt the edge of scandal. But others knew the world had changed. The age of silence had ended with Diana's interview, with Meghan and Harry's own revelations to Oprah, with the relentless glare of social media. In this new age, secrets could not be buried. If Harry chose to speak, the monarchy would be powerless to stop him. The crisis also reached William, caught in the impossible position of brother and heir. He loved Harry, yet he was bound to protect the institution he would one day lead. In private, he wrestled with questions of loyalty. Could he defend Harry if the truth came out, or would he be forced to stand with the monarchy against his own brother? The burden crushed him. To betray Harry would be to betray the bond forged in childhood, but to betray the crown would be to betray his destiny. It was a choice William had prayed he would never have to make, yet now it loomed closer with each passing day. For Harry, the crisis was not a game of strategy, but a personal reckoning. He had the truth in his hands, and he refused to live in silence anymore. Meghan, who had already endured the wrath of the British press and the coldness of palace life, stood firmly by his side. Together, they debated their options. Should they reveal the truth publicly, forcing the monarchy to confront it? Or should they keep it private, protecting their children from the inevitable firestorm? The decision was agonizing. To speak would mean unleashing chaos. To remain silent would mean carrying the burden forever, passing it on to another generation. Meanwhile, the wider royal family reacted with shock and division. Some sympathized with Harry, recognizing the cruelty of his lifelong doubt. Others resented him, seeing his choice to seek the truth as selfish, as a betrayal of the family's survival. Old wounds reopened. Accusations and suspicions flew behind closed doors. The unity the monarchy had tried to project to the public fractured into bitter factions, each with their own vision of how to survive the storm. The crisis was not confined to the palace. Rumors began to leak. The press, ever hungry for scandal, sensed that something monumental was unfolding. Journalists whispered of secret tests, of rifts between father and son, of truths too dangerous to print without confirmation. Though the full story had not yet broken, the atmosphere of secrecy only fueled speculation. Every public appearance by Charles, every event attended by William, every photograph of Harry was scrutinized for clues. The monarchy's silence, once its greatest shield, now seemed like an admission of guilt. As the crisis deepened, Charles faced sleepless nights. His role as king demanded composure, but his private thoughts betrayed him. He wondered if the crown he had waited his entire life to wear would be destroyed not by politics or enemies abroad, but by the truth of his own family. He resented Diana for the choices she had made, resented Harry for forcing the truth into the light, resented himself for the coldness that had defined his fatherhood. Above all, he feared history's judgment. What would they call him in the chronicles of time? A steady king, or the monarch under whom the House of Windsor began to crumble? In times of crisis, the monarchy has always turned to its traditions, its rituals, its carefully curated image of permanence. But in this storm, tradition offered no answers. Bloodline was the monarchy's foundation, and bloodline had been broken. The family was left with a question as old as the institution itself. What matters more, truth or survival? Harry's DNA test had done more than expose his parentage. It had exposed the monarchy's fragility, the thin line between image and reality. For centuries, the crown had projected an illusion of unbroken continuity, of divine order. Now, that illusion was cracking, and the royal family found itself in crisis not just of scandal but of identity. Who were they if their lineage could be questioned? What was the monarchy if its legitimacy rested on secrets and silence? The crisis was far from over. The family could try to contain it, to silence Harry, to preserve the crown. But secrets of this magnitude have a way of escaping, of demanding light. And as the palace scrambled to control the storm, the world waited, sensing that the truth, long buried in whispers, was finally ready to explode. Every secret kept within palace walls eventually seeps out, whether through whispers, hints, or the relentless curiosity of the public. For decades, people speculated about Prince Harry's parentage, comparing photographs, mocking his hair color, and weaving stories about James Hewitt into the fabric of royal gossip. But when the revelation of the DNA test began to ripple beyond the family's private corridors, the world sensed that the whispers were no longer rumor. They were truth on the verge of being exposed. The public, long fascinated by scandal, now awakened to a story that threatened to eclipse every royal controversy before it. The first stirrings came in the media. Journalists who had followed the royal family for years noticed subtle shifts. The tone of Harry's public appearances had changed. His words carried a weight they hadn't before. Palace insiders leaked fragments of tension between Harry, Charles, and William. Social media amplified the noise, where conspiracy theories mixed with genuine curiosity, creating a storm impossible to contain. Online forums dissected Harry's every gesture, searching for signs of confirmation. Hashtags trended with ruthless speed. People no longer asked if the rumors were true. They asked when the truth would finally come out. For the British public, the possibility was both thrilling and devastating. The monarchy, for all its flaws, was seen as a symbol of continuity. To admit that one of Diana's sons was not Charles's biological child threatened to unravel that symbol. Yet at the same time, there was fascination. Ordinary people, long resentful of royal privilege, saw in Harry's revelation a crack in the gilded facade. The crown, untouchable for centuries, suddenly seemed fragile, human, and vulnerable. For some, it was a chance to question the very legitimacy of monarchy itself. For others, it was a tragedy, a betrayal of Diana's memory, and a humiliation for Harry. In pubs, in living rooms, in offices across the country, the conversations began. Was Harry really Hewitt's son? Did Charles know all along? Did Diana plan to reveal the truth before her death? The questions spread like wildfire, fueled by television panels, talk radio hosts, and newspaper columnists eager to cash in on the scandal. The public, long accustomed to royal drama, felt they were on the edge of the ultimate revelation, one that would redefine everything they thought they knew about the House of Windsor. Internationally, the story carried even greater resonance. Diana's global appeal meant that Harry's truth belonged not only to Britain, but to the world. In America, where Meghan and Harry had carved out a new life, the press was relentless in its coverage. U.S. outlets framed the story as one of liberation, of a man breaking free from a dynasty built on secrecy. In Europe, the story was treated with a mix of shock and fascination, with commentators drawing parallels to royal scandals of the past that had shaken monarchies to their cores. Around the world, people watched closely, sensing that history was unfolding in real time. The public's awakening was not limited to gossip or fascination. It carried a political edge. Republicans in Britain, those who had long argued for the end of the monarchy, seized on the revelation as proof of the institution's irrelevance. If the bloodline was fractured, if the very foundation of hereditary rule could be questioned, then what justification remained for the monarchy's existence? For them, Harry's DNA test was not just personal tragedy, but political opportunity. But for millions of ordinary people, the awakening was more personal. They saw Harry not as a prince, but as a man betrayed by silence. His tears resonated with those who had lost parents, who had grown up in fractured families, who had struggled with questions of identity. The public's empathy for him grew, even as debates raged about the monarchy's future. Harry became, once again, the people's prince, not because of his titles, but because of his pain. His story, raw and unvarnished, cut through centuries of pomp and tradition, striking at the universal human desire to know where we come from. The press frenzy that followed the whispers of the DNA test bordered on hysteria. Photographers camped outside Montecito, hoping to capture Harry and Meghan. Commentators speculated about William's reaction, about Charles's silence, about Camilla's role in shaping the palace's response. Every newspaper carried headlines dripping with speculation. Some tabloids claimed to have sources confirming the truth. Others insisted it was all fabricated drama. But the more the palace refused to comment, the more the public believed the rumors were true. Silence, once the monarchy's shield, had become its loudest admission. For Harry, the future meant freedom. For William, it meant burden. For Charles, it meant legacy. And for the monarchy, it meant survival in a world where the public had finally awakened to the power of truth. Every story, no matter how long it is buried, comes to its reckoning. For the British monarchy, the reckoning arrived not as a sudden explosion, but as the slow, grinding force of truth pressing against centuries of tradition. Prince Harry's DNA revelation was no longer just a private family tragedy or a tabloid sensation. It had grown into a global question about the monarchy itself. The crown had faced scandals before, but none as existential as this. The final reckoning was not just about Harry or Charles, or even Diana. It was about whether an institution built on blood could survive when blood itself betrayed it. Harry had never sought to become a revolutionary. His desire had been deeply personal, to know who he truly was. But in choosing to face the truth, he had inadvertently forced the monarchy to face itself. The reckoning was brutal. It stripped away the carefully woven tapestry of image and illusion, leaving only raw humanity exposed beneath the jewels and ceremonies. For centuries, the monarchy's power had been its mystique. Now, mystique was shattered, and all that remained were people, flawed, grieving, divided people, trying to hold together an institution collapsing under the weight of reality. For Charles, the reckoning came in silence. He continued to perform his duties as king, his public composure intact, but behind his eyes lay a storm that no crown could contain. He thought of Diana constantly, of the choices she made, of the truths she carried to her grave. He thought of Harry's tears, of William's anguish, of his own failure to bridge the distance between himself and his youngest son. The reckoning for Charles was not only public humiliation, but private torment. The knowledge that history would judge him not only as a monarch, but as a man who could not keep his family whole. For William, the reckoning was even more complex. As heir, his destiny was tied to the survival of the crown. But as a brother, his heart was tied to Harry. He faced the impossible task of balancing loyalty to family with loyalty to institution. Every step he took was dissected by the press, every word measured against the question of whether he could lead the monarchy into a future without mystique. The reckoning for William was the realization that his reign, when it came, would be defined not by tradition but by adaptation. If he could not redefine the monarchy in modern terms, it would crumble under the shadow of Harry's truth. For the public, the reckoning was both liberating and devastating. They had long suspected the monarchy of hiding secrets, but suspicion had always been easier to tolerate than confirmation. Now that the truth was undeniable, they were forced to confront what the monarchy really meant. Was it a sacred institution blessed by history, or was it, as critics claimed, a relic sustained by silence and privilege? The reckoning divided the nation. Some clung to the crown with desperation, unwilling to let go of the one symbol of continuity in uncertain times. Others saw the revelation as the final proof that monarchy was obsolete, demanding its abolition with renewed vigor. The reckoning stretched beyond Britain's borders. In Commonwealth nations, leaders debated whether their allegiance to the crown still made sense. In Australia, Republicans surged in strength, their calls for independence amplified by Harry's truth. In the Caribbean, where resentment toward colonial legacy simmered, the scandal became a rallying cry for breaking free. The reckoning was not just British, it was global, forcing nations to decide whether the crown's shadow still held value in the modern age. For Harry himself, the reckoning was paradoxical. On one hand, he had lost everything: the certainty of his identity, the fragile bond with his father, the possibility of reconciliation with the institution that defined his life. On the other hand, he had gained something invaluable: freedom. No longer shackled by whispers, no longer defined by doubt, Harry finally knew who he was. The reckoning for him was acceptance, the painful acknowledgement of truth, but also the liberation that comes with it. His life, once shaped by secrets, could now be shaped by choice. The monarchy, however, did not have the same luxury. Its future hinged on survival, and survival required reinvention. Advisors whispered of rebranding the crown as a symbol of service rather than blood. But the reckoning made such rebranding difficult. The very idea of monarchy is rooted in lineage, in the divine right of descent. To abandon blood was to abandon the essence of monarchy itself. The family stood trapped in a paradox. To cling to tradition was to risk irrelevance, but to abandon it was to risk collapse. As the months wore on, the reckoning deepened. Polls revealed declining support for the crown, particularly among younger generations. Commentators declared that the monarchy had entered its twilight. And yet, the institution did not fall. It endured, as it always had, not through strength but through inertia, through the reluctance of a nation to let go of its oldest symbol. The reckoning had not yet ended the monarchy, but it had forever changed it. The crown was no longer untouchable. It was fragile, questioned, doubted, vulnerable in ways it had never been before. The final reckoning was not a single moment of collapse, but an ongoing process of erosion. Each public appearance, each speech, each ceremony was now weighed against the shadow of Harry's truth. The crown still glittered, but its shine was dimmed by the knowledge that even its bloodline was not immune to fracture. For those who once believed in its divine continuity, the revelation was shattering. For those who had always doubted, it was vindication. Either way, the monarchy could never return to what it once was. And so, the reckoning left the royal family standing at the edge of history. Charles wore the crown, William prepared to inherit it, and Harry walked his own path, freed by truth but burdened by its consequences. The monarchy endured, but it endured in shadow, its future uncertain, its mystique forever broken. The reckoning had arrived, and with it, the realization that no crown, however ancient, can survive untouched when truth demands its due. The story of Prince Harry's DNA revelation is not just a tale of scandal within a royal household. It is a story of identity, family, and the unrelenting power of truth. It began with whispers in palace corridors, fueled by the cruel comparisons of tabloids, and carried through decades of rumor and speculation. It passed through the grief of a boy who lost his mother too young, through the rebellion of a young man struggling to find his place, and through the courage of an adult who finally chose to face the shadows that had haunted him all his life. At its core, it is the story of one man's search to know who he truly is. For Harry, the revelation was devastating. The truth stripped him of certainty, severing his ties to the man who had raised him, confirming the whispers that had mocked him since childhood. And yet, it was also liberating. For the first time, he no longer lived in doubt. He no longer carried the burden of unanswered questions. The boy mocked in schoolyards, the man haunted by tabloids, the prince doubted by his own family. He was gone. In his place stood a man who had faced the truth, no matter how painful, and emerged with clarity. The weight of truth crushed him, but it also freed him. For Charles, the truth was torment. The crown he had waited a lifetime to wear became heavier with the knowledge that one of the sons presented as his was not truly his. His dilemma was brutal. To acknowledge the truth was to risk the crown. To deny it was to lose his son forever. In the end, Charles became the embodiment of the monarchy itself, bound by silence, trapped by pride, unable to embrace truth for fear of its consequences. His reign, however long it lasts, will forever be marked by the shadow of this revelation. For William, the truth was a fracture. He loved his brother, defended him against whispers, and mourned with him in childhood. Yet now he faced the reality that they were not bound by the same father. Their bond was not broken, but it was reshaped, tested by loyalty to one another and to the crown. William's burden is perhaps the heaviest of all. To carry the monarchy into a future where its legitimacy is questioned, to lead a crown that shines less brightly than it once did, and to reconcile the love of a brother with the duty of a king. For the monarchy, the truth was existential. Its legitimacy has always rested on bloodline, on the unbroken descent of one generation to the next. But the DNA test shattered that illusion. It revealed that even the crown's most sacred foundation can fracture, that the mystique of monarchy is as vulnerable as the people who wear its jewels. The future of the monarchy now depends not on tradition alone, but on its ability to adapt, to redefine itself not by blood, but by service. Whether it can survive that transformation remains uncertain. For the public, the truth was a mirror. It exposed the fragility of institutions, but it also reflected universal human struggles. Who am I? Where do I come from? What secrets shape my family, my identity, my life? Millions saw in Harry's story a reflection of their own questions, their own wounds. The monarchy's crisis became a human story, reminding the world that behind crowns and carriages are people who bleed, cry, and suffer like anyone else. The truth that shook the palace resonated far beyond it, touching lives across the globe. The weight of truth also forced the world to re-examine Diana's legacy. She was the woman who defied the crown, who loved her children fiercely, who carried secrets she could never reveal. Her life, her choices, and her death shaped the men her sons became. And in Harry's defiance, in his refusal to remain silent, her spirit lived on. The truth confirmed that Diana's story was not finished. It continues to echo in the lives of her children and in the questions they must answer. In the end, the story is not just about scandal. It is about courage. Harry's decision to face the truth, knowing it could shatter everything, was an act of bravery. It was the choice to live in honesty rather than in shadow. The cost was immense. His relationship with his family strained, the monarchy weakened, his life forever changed. But the reward was clarity, freedom, and the chance to build a future not defined by whispers, but by truth. The monarchy stands at a crossroads. It may endure, as it has endured for centuries, reshaping itself to fit a modern world. Or it may decline, eroded by the relentless force of truth that no tradition can contain. Its future is uncertain, but one thing is clear: it will never again be untouched, never again untouchable. The crown has been shaken, its mystique broken, its survival no longer guaranteed. For Harry, the journey continues. The truth has given him pain, but it has also given him peace. He now walks a path not as a prince defined by blood, but as a man defined by choice. His legacy will not be the titles he lost or the scandals he endured. His legacy will be the courage to face the truth and to live freely in its light. And so, the story comes full circle. What began as whispers in palace halls became a revelation that shook the world. What began as the pain of a boy became the reckoning of a man. What began as rumor became history. The weight of truth cannot be denied, and though it has shaken the monarchy, it has also set Harry free. The world will debate the monarchy's future, but Harry has already claimed his own. The final question is not whether the monarchy will survive, but whether it should. And in that question lies the true power of Harry's revelation. It forces us all to ask not just what we believe about crowns and bloodlines, but what we believe about truth, love, and the meaning of family. That is the reckoning, and that is the legacy of a prince who broke into tears but refused to live in silence any longer. The crisis soon spilled into Parliament, where questions were raised about the implications for the line of succession. Though Harry had already stepped back from his royal role, the idea that he had never been a legitimate Windsor forced uncomfortable conversations. Would his children have any standing within the royal framework? What would this mean for the monarchy's image abroad? Though no official debates took place on record, the chatter behind the scenes was intense. Politicians knew that the public awakening to such a truth could reshape the monarchy's relationship with the people in profound ways. Amid all this, ordinary citizens began to speak out. Letters to newspapers, callers on radio shows, and posts online revealed a mix of sympathy and anger. Many sympathized with Harry, praising him for his courage to seek the truth. They saw in him a reflection of Diana's defiance, a refusal to be silenced by the institution that had crushed her. Others, however, reacted with fury, accusing Harry of betraying the crown and undermining the monarchy's stability. To them, the DNA test was not liberation but treason. This divide mirrored the larger cultural split in Britain between those who saw the monarchy as sacred and those who saw it as outdated. For the royal family, the public awakening was their worst nightmare. Once whispers became public debate, control slipped through their fingers. No press officer, no carefully staged photo opportunity, no royal tour could redirect attention away from the scandal. The public, once deferential, was now demanding answers. They wanted confirmation. They wanted honesty. They wanted to know whether the boy they had mourned with at Diana's funeral, the man they had watched grow up under the crown, was truly a Windsor by blood. Harry, watching the awakening unfold from California, felt a mix of dread and resolve. The storm he had feared all his life was now raging, and yet, he no longer felt the same paralysis. The truth had given him clarity. The world might react with shock, anger, or sympathy, but he no longer had to wonder. For the first time, he knew who he was. That knowledge gave him a strength he had never felt before. The awakening of the public was beyond his control, but his own awakening had already happened. He was no longer the boy in the shadow of doubt. He was a man living in truth. The monarchy, however, was left to contend with a truth it could not control. The people were awake now, their eyes open to the fragility of an institution built on secrets. And once the public awakens, it does not fall back asleep. The question was no longer whether the truth would destroy the monarchy. It was how long the monarchy could survive in a world where truth could no longer be buried. The truth, once unearthed, is a force that cannot be controlled. For decades, the British monarchy thrived on carefully cultivated appearances, silences, and half-truths designed to keep the mystique of the crown intact. But when Harry's DNA revelation reached beyond palace gates, the illusion fractured. The aftermath was swift, merciless, and all-consuming. It was no longer about whispers and speculation. It was about a fact that the entire world could not ignore. The monarchy now faced not only a scandal, but a reckoning. In the days following the exposure, newspapers across the globe printed the story with headlines so bold they seemed almost surreal. Harry, not Charles's son. Television anchors delivered the news with a gravity usually reserved for war or catastrophe. Social media platforms exploded with debates, memes, and heated arguments. Some sympathized with Harry, praising his courage to seek answers after a lifetime of pain. Others lambasted him, accusing him of betraying the very institution that gave him his name and privilege. But regardless of opinion, one thing was clear. The story had eclipsed every royal scandal before it. The world was awake, and the crown could no longer hide. Within Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. Staff moved with hushed voices, as though afraid that even the walls might betray them. Senior advisors convened daily, drafting responses, debating strategies. Should Charles acknowledge the truth, offering a public statement of compassion for his son? Or should the family cling to denial, maintaining silence in the hope that time would erode the story's power? Each option carried catastrophic risks. Acknowledgement could humanize Charles, but also confirm the monarchy's vulnerability. Silence could protect the crown temporarily, but would fuel accusations of cowardice and deceit. The institution stood frozen, caught between truth and survival. For Charles, the aftermath was torment. Publicly, he maintained the composure of a monarch, attending engagements, shaking hands, and delivering speeches as though nothing had changed. Privately, he was a man unraveling. The shame of being exposed as the non-father of Diana's son cut deeper than any political attack he had endured. He thought of Diana constantly, her smile, her defiance, her secrets, and he hated her for leaving him with this burden, even as he mourned her absence. He thought of Harry with a mixture of sorrow and resentment, unable to decide whether to reach for him or turn away. His dilemma had become reality, and there was no retreat from the judgment of history. William, too, bore the weight of the aftermath. The brother he had defended against rumors was now proven to be only half his by blood. Their bond was not erased, but it was altered forever. The public looked to William for reassurance, for strength in a time of crisis. But behind closed doors, he struggled with grief and anger. How could he lead the monarchy into the future while his brother's truth threatened to destabilize it? How could he protect Harry while also protecting the crown? Each step he took was scrutinized, each word parsed for meaning. The aftermath forced William into a role he was unprepared for, the guardian not just of tradition, but of a monarchy on the brink. For Harry, the aftermath was liberation and devastation intertwined. The burden of whispers had finally lifted. He no longer lived in doubt, no longer carried the weight of suspicion. But the clarity came at a cost. His relationship with his family, already strained, teetered on the edge of collapse. He knew the monarchy would see him as a threat, as the son who had brought their greatest secret into the light. Yet he also felt a strange calm. He had lived too long in the prison of silence. Now, even if the world judged him harshly, he was free. The aftermath was painful, but it was honest, and honesty was the one thing he had craved all his life. The public's reaction deepened as days turned into weeks. Protests outside palace gates called for transparency. Royal loyalists clung desperately to denial, accusing Harry of fabrication, while critics of the monarchy demanded abolition, arguing that the crown no longer held legitimacy. Internationally, the scandal became a symbol of the dangers of institutions built on secrecy. In America, Harry and Meghan were portrayed as figures of resilience, standing against an archaic system. In Britain, opinions fractured the nation, turning dinner tables and workplaces into battlegrounds of debate. The monarchy was no longer just a family, it was a fault line dividing a country. The aftermath also raised questions about succession. Legally, Harry had already removed himself from the line by stepping back from royal duties. But morally, the revelation cast doubt on everything. If Charles had knowingly raised a son who was not his, what did that say about his fitness as king? If the monarchy's survival depended on bloodlines, what did it mean when those bloodlines were proven fractured? Politicians avoided addressing the issue directly, but whispers in Parliament revealed deep unease. The monarchy had been weakened before, but never in such a fundamental way. In private, Harry and Meghan discussed the path forward. Should they give interviews, telling the world their side of the story, framing it not as betrayal, but as truth and healing? Or should they retreat into silence, letting the storm rage without their participation? Meghan, ever pragmatic, recognized the risks of speaking out. Yet she also believed their story had power, the power to reshape not just their lives but the public's understanding of truth, family, and monarchy. Harry wavered. He longed for peace, but he also knew that silence had cost him too much already. The aftermath forced him into a role he had never sought, a reluctant revolutionary, a man whose very existence now symbolized both the fragility of monarchy and the unrelenting power of truth. The crisis reverberated even among ordinary people who had no stake in the monarchy. For them, Harry's story was universal. It was the story of identity, of the human need to know where we come from. It was the story of betrayal by silence, of the pain of growing up with unanswered questions. People who had taken DNA tests themselves, uncovering family secrets, saw their own struggles reflected in his. The aftermath connected Harry not just to the public as a prince, but as a man whose pain mirrored theirs. His revelation was royal in scale but profoundly human in meaning. The monarchy, meanwhile, scrambled to preserve itself. Public engagements were doubled, charity appearances increased, photo opportunities staged with calculated warmth. William and Kate were pushed further into the spotlight as symbols of stability. But no amount of smiling photographs could erase the truth the world now knew. The aftermath of exposure was not a scandal that could be papered over. It was a wound that cut to the heart of monarchy, a wound that would not heal with silence. As weeks turned into months, the royal family faced a choice. They could continue to deny, to retreat behind their walls of tradition, hoping the storm would pass. Or they could confront the truth, acknowledge Harry's revelation, and attempt to redefine themselves not by bloodline, but by service and symbolism. It was a crossroads moment, one that would determine not only their survival, but their relevance in a modern world. For Harry, the aftermath was both an ending and a beginning. The life he had lived as a Windsor was over, stripped of certainty and legitimacy. But in its place stood a new life, one defined not by titles or crowns, but by truth. He was no longer the boy mocked for his hair or the man doubted for his choices. He was, finally, himself. The aftermath of exposure had destroyed the illusion, but it had also given him something the monarchy never could: freedom. The monarchy is built on the illusion of permanence. For centuries, it has survived wars, revolutions, abdications, and scandals, presenting itself as an unbroken thread tying the past to the present. But with Harry's DNA revelation, that thread was frayed as never before. The question was no longer whether the monarchy could endure public scrutiny. It was whether it could survive the truth. The future of the institution now hung in the balance, weighed down by a revelation that cut to its very core: legitimacy of blood. In the immediate aftermath, the royal family tried to project unity. William and Kate were thrust further into the spotlight as the future of the crown, attending engagements with their children, offering the public an image of stability. Charles continued his duties as king with quiet determination, speaking of service and tradition, as though repeating the words often enough might restore faith in them. Camilla, ever pragmatic, urged silence and composure, believing the scandal would fade as others had before it. But beneath the polished exterior, the cracks widened. The family's silence no longer reassured the public, it enraged them. In a modern world that demands transparency, the old rules of secrecy and stoicism rang hollow. The British public, divided in their loyalties, began to question more openly whether the monarchy was still relevant. For monarchists, William's presence offered hope. He was steady, dutiful, a man who carried himself with the gravitas of a future king. But even they could not ignore the fact that the monarchy's survival rested on the idea of divine bloodline. If Harry, Diana's son, was not truly of Windsor descent, what other secrets might the crown conceal? If the foundation of legitimacy could be fractured once, why should anyone trust it again? Republicans seized the moment with vigor. They argued that the monarchy, already an archaic institution, had now been exposed as fraudulent at its core. Protesters gathered outside Buckingham Palace, holding signs that read "Truth over tradition" and "In the monarchy now." In Parliament, the whispers grew louder. While no immediate moves were made to dismantle the monarchy, the revelation gave fresh ammunition to those who had long argued for its abolition. The monarchy, once untouchable, was now vulnerable. The international stage complicated matters further. Across the Commonwealth, nations debated their allegiance to the crown. Some leaders saw the scandal as the perfect moment to break free, to sever symbolic ties to a monarchy thousands of miles away. In Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean, discussions about republicanism gained new momentum. Harry's truth was no longer just a British family drama. It was a global crisis for an institution struggling to remain relevant in the modern world. For William, the future weighed heavily. He knew the crown would one day be his, and the DNA revelation made his task infinitely harder. To lead, he would need to restore faith not only in himself, but in the entire institution. Yet he faced a dilemma no less profound than his father's. Should he embrace transparency, acknowledging Harry's truth and redefining the monarchy's legitimacy around service rather than blood? Or should he cling to tradition, insisting that silence and symbolism were enough? Either choice risked alienating millions. The monarchy's survival depended not just on continuity, but on adaptability, and William was left to determine how far the institution could bend without breaking. Harry, though no longer a working royal, remained central to the monarchy's future. His story had become a mirror reflecting the institution's flaws. For the public, he symbolized both the fragility of royal blood and the resilience of personal truth. Whether he liked it or not, his choices would continue to shape how the world viewed the crown. If he chose to speak openly, the monarchy would face unrelenting pressure. If he chose silence, the crown might buy time, but at the cost of trust. The monarchy's future was no longer entirely in the hands of its heirs. It was also in the hands of the son who had stepped away. The institution faced practical questions as well. Would Harry's children, Archie and Lilibet, hold titles in light of the revelation? Would their names remain in the line of succession? Legal experts debated these questions, but the answers mattered less than the symbolism. If the monarchy stripped them of recognition, it would appear cruel and vindictive. If it allowed them to remain, it would tacitly acknowledge that legitimacy no longer rested solely on blood. Either way, the monarchy's very definition of family was at stake. Public trust, once the crown's strongest currency, eroded rapidly. Polls revealed a sharp decline in support for Charles, and even William's popularity showed signs of strain. The younger generation, already skeptical of monarchy, voiced louder calls for change. To them, Harry's revelation confirmed what they had long suspected, that the monarchy was not a divine institution, but a fragile human construct sustained by secrecy and image. The older generation, though more loyal, found it harder to defend the crown when confronted with undeniable truth. The monarchy had always survived by embodying stability, but now it symbolized uncertainty. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, strategy meetings grew more frantic. Advisors debated rebranding the crown as an institution of service rather than lineage, emphasizing charity, duty, and modern values. Others argued that clinging to tradition was the only path forward, that abandoning bloodline legitimacy would unravel the very essence of monarchy. The family stood at a crossroads, uncertain of which path would lead to survival and which to destruction. Yet amid the chaos, one reality became clear: the monarchy would never be the same. The DNA revelation had not merely created a scandal, it had changed the narrative forever. The crown could no longer claim unbroken lineage without inviting skepticism. Every speech, every ceremony, every photograph would now carry the shadow of Harry's truth. The monarchy's future was not guaranteed. It was fragile, dependent on the choices of individuals navigating an institution that had thrived on silence for centuries. For the public, the question became whether the monarchy could evolve or whether it had reached its end. Could it survive as a symbolic institution detached from the rigidity of bloodline? Or would the revelation prove to be the beginning of its decline, a reminder that even crowns are powerless against truth? The answer remained uncertain, but one thing was undeniable. The monarchy stood on the edge of history, its future no longer secured by tradition but tested by truth.